Okay, hi, it's shcores. Welcome back to my channel. So today I'm going to talk about a diverse list of own voices books that I have read since at the start of the year. So this is since January 2020. These are like the books I've been reading this year. This is like not even all of the own voices books I've like just generally read this year. This is sort of more of like a selection of like picks of things I want to talk about, things like I've been thinking about when I've been reading these own voices books. And I also wanted to give a diverse selection in terms of like own voices books in different genres, different age groups, demographics, told in different styles. So more than just like, like different kinds of people, which like I do recognize that this list doesn't necessarily encompass like, all different sort of like demographics of people. It kind of is focused around like a specific like general kind of groupings of authors. So I probably could diversify in that way. But these are just like the books that I've read this year that kind of have made me think about things like that I'm reading or things in my life that I kind of want to talk about today. Okay, so and the kind of in no particular order. So the first book I want to talk about is The Black Flamingo by Dean Atta. This is a book that I have like really complicated feelings about. I think I rated it like 3.5 stars, maybe 4, I can't remember. Because at the end of the day, like I felt like I wanted to like it a lot more than I did. So if you don't know, it's a verse novel, sort of YA verse novel about a mixed black and Greek boy growing up, coming out as gay, sort of like finding out his identity and the identity of like the people around him in Britain, in generally London, and then in Brighton. So my kind of biggest issue with this book is that I felt like it spent a lot of time trying to explain different terms and like different things to people. It felt like all of the characters were there just to have like, this discussion about, like one element of social justice, and it felt a little bit tiring because it would bring me out of the story. It would bring me out of like connecting with the characters, because then they'd like sit down and give me like beginners 101 about internalized homophobia, or like beginners 101 about like, being mixed race or whatever. And for me, it's like both someone who's like mixed race and someone who is like gay, and someone who's like had like gender dysphoria and stuff like that. It felt really tiresome because it just felt like he was teaching me things I already knew. And to me, it was kind of unfortunate that it made me feel this way, because like when the story actually got going and when the book really like I felt was like really really strong was when it was leaning into its verse elements. Like there was like some really strong bits of verse. There was like parts that made me feel really emotionally connected with the book. Like especially when he's talking about being in sort of like university in a small town, in a relatively small town in the UK, having come from like a big city, feeling both mixed race and, being both mixed race and gay, and not feeling connected to any of these like groups of people. Like the scene of him going to all of these different like cultural societies and not connecting with anyone in them at all, and feeling like just like a complete outsider, even though this is like meant to be a group that's about like uplifting him and uplifting people like him, where he's able to connect with people. I like that scene like hit me really hard because I completely have had that experience before. That was very much my experience of going to university in the UK, and sort of part of the reason that like when I was in university, I didn't really do that much in terms of like cultural societies or even sort of like the LGBT society. I didn't spend that much time there just because I constantly felt that feeling of alienation, and I kind of just wished the book spent more time on that and more time, like with the verse, with kind of like teasing out these complex emotions and like looking at them in this like really interesting and beautiful way, rather than kind of trying to give me like social justice 101. So like I think this is a book that if you haven't necessarily had sort of like that kind of experience that I'm describing, I think it can be really interesting because it may kind of illuminate these like feelings of like being mixed race or like feelings about like being gay, especially in Britain. If you haven't had that experience, I think it can be really illuminating. But for someone who kind of has had that experience and kind of like already does understand that feeling, I didn't necessarily like I felt a bit tired because I just wanted like less kind of beginners social justice stuff and more kind of complex just like complexity behind it. So that was kind of like my feelings around that. And so the next book, which I kind of want to bring up for the same reason, is Invisible Differences by Julie Dachez. I hope I'm pronouncing her name right. And Mademoiselle Caroline. So this is a graphic novel, own voices book about being diagnosed with autism as an adult. So this is actually, I'm really excited because this is like the first arc I've ever been approved for. And I was like really excited to read this book because it's about like being diagnosed with autism as an adult, which is like, definitely something that I went through this year. I was diagnosed with autism, and it was like I really wanted to sort of like read a book, sort of by an own voices autistic author writing about that same experience. I would like, I was excited to kind of see what was going on, and I think I'd probably rate this book like a 4. Like again, it's sort of like a 3.754 to me. I did enjoy it. I thought it was really strong in the beginning. I think this book starts with a lot of space. It's hard to describe, but this book really has like um, it has a very illustrative style, so it's not necessarily super comicsy. It's more kind of like graphic illustration, sort of magazine type illustration that's then brought into sort of a comic sphere. So, and I think it uses its style very well. I think this book really shines, and the illustration really shines in the way that it kind of begins the story, and it shows you like the feeling of space and the feeling of like loneliness very well. Kind of like the isolation, but also the calmness that can come from routine. And also, I think it illustrates, the feeling of having an autistic meltdown, or the feeling of, distance between you and the people in your life when you're autistic, especially when you're undiagnosed. And so I think like for me this book, like that was the strongest part. That was like the part at the at the beginning, kind of up until the first half of the book. Like I really really liked this. I liked the way it was illustrated. I liked the way it was displaying like these feelings that I also sort of very much connected with. And I also liked, like it started talking about like the trying to explain to like other people in your life, you kind of feel this way, but you're not diagnosed, and people are saying, well, like, you can't be autistic, you make eye contact, or you can't be autistic, like you're talking, you're not like beating your head against the wall. And I really appreciated that because I think that's also like an experience that I've had when you're like trying to tell people. And I like that's something that I did like. my issues with this book is that I feel that, again, kind of like the Black Flamingo, it is very much a book about autism for people who are not autistic, or for people who don't really know much about what it's like to be autistic, or what it's like these kind of experiences and these kinds of struggles. I think it does quite a bit of hand holding for like holistic people, trying to explain to them, like, this is what it's like these are these are all these different facets of like being autistic. Like, look, this is what it's like to be diagnosed with autism. This is what it's like to like talk to people with when you have autism. And so I feel like, at least for me, when it kind of started veering into that territory where it was like autism 101, that's when it kind of lost me. I didn't it was just like, it was not what I was really hoping for when I was reading this book. I kind of didn't want to be taught more about my developmental disorder. Like, I already kind of know that. So the hand holding is kind of just like where Own Voices book loses me. And I think like there are Own Voices books that are for for those people, or it's like about those, and then they and I think there's like Own Voices books where it kind of gets this like higher level where you're telling your story, but you're also able to have this like complexity and nuance, because the people that you're intending to read this story are people who are kind of like similar to you, or have the same experiences as you. So you're telling the story to someone who is like you. And then I think there are Own Voices stories that are very much like beginners diverse books. You're telling this story to someone who is not like you. And these kinds of books are books that I wanted to read, because I thought that they were going to be less of telling it to people who weren't like you, and more of it telling these stories to like people who, like me, who like already have all of this knowledge. So I just like, personally, I think that these books weren't necessarily written kind of for me. I think they were written more for people who had less knowledge about these topics, and need to be informed a little bit more, or want to learn a bit more about what it's like to belong to these groups or have these identities. And my other issue with Invisible Differences is that it throughout the entire book, it refers to autism as or the form of autism that the author has as Asperger's syndrome. And you only get a like just you only get like a information that in the current DSM-5, I think it is, that we no longer use the term Asperger's syndrome. It's we just describe autism. All autism falls under autism spectrum disorder, which it's meant to highlight that there isn't really like a separation between like different kinds of autism. Autism is a spectrum. Some people have more needs than others, but like all autistics fall under this autism spectrum. You can't really like have a solid differentiation between these two kinds of autism. So I feel like I understand. I think that within the context of the like memoir, I think that talking about it as Asperger's makes sense. Obviously, this is like Julie Dachez's like history. This is her experience, and I totally understand why they chose to call it Asperger's. In that, like in that situation, I just feel like there should have been it. Like I shouldn't have to get to sort of like the appendices where it's like explaining autism to me. Where to get a like tiny footnote that says, oh, by the way, in 2013, we stopped using the term Asperger's, and we started to use ASD, or autism spectrum disorder. And then even after that footnote, there's like more appendices about having autism. And again, these like continue to refer to Asperger's, Aspies, etc., etc. And I just feel like that for a book that is meant to be about educating people who don't have autism about autism, I feel like using the wrong terminology is not a good move, especially as I believe like Asperger himself was like a Nazi doctor. Like he's like not a good historical fiction, like not a good historical figure. So I think that like just like generally it's kind of like a bad move, or it's not like the best way in my opinion to educate people about autism who like are autistic or who don't necessarily have as much information or knowledge about autism. So that was like the one thing that like kind of irritated me the entire time I was reading this book, and then also like the entire time like the way this book is like being marketed and stuff like that. That's like the one thing that like is really irritating. But like apart from that, I think if you don't know a lot about autism, if you don't know, if you are autistic, especially if you don't know a lot about autism in adults, or you don't know any autistic adults, which you probably do. They may not have just told you, but I think that this is a pretty good book to kind of like have this introduction and have like some explanation about like autistic traits and what it feels like to be autistic. Just like remember that this book is a memoir. It's not necessarily descriptive or prescriptive of the entire autistic community. Lots of people display their autistic traits very differently. So um, that's like those two books. So like the third book I want to talk about is the Hana Wars by Adiba Jaigirdar. Oh, Jaigirdar. Oh, I'm so sorry if I pronounced her name wrong. So this book, if you don't know what it's about a young Bengali girl who comes out as a lesbian to her family, and then she, she is having this competition um, with her school about starting their own business, and she starts a henna business, and then one of her classmates also starts a henna business. And so it's about sort of cultural appropriation. It's also sort of like a rivals to lovers story. It's a YA sort of romance, contemporary. And I enjoyed it. I thought it was very sweet. I thought it's really cute. I felt like it was a little bit young for me, which is more like, again, like my issue as a reader. I think it was just like not quite what I was looking for, or like not quite the kind of book that like really grabs a hold of me. So it was just like a little bit young, but other than that, I think it's a really sweet story. If you like these kinds of like soft romances, I think it's really cute. And I also think it does handle like being an immigrant, being like this feeling of isolation really well. And like the story of like coming out to like immigrant parents, having South Asian parents, and like having this kind of have to deal with the idea of like family and reputation as something that is like like it's very important to you and your family to consider these things, and it's difficult, I think, to marry these kinds of old world or like traditional cultural values with sort of like also your these new westernized values that you learn when you're living in sort of like a more western country. And so I think it deals with that conflict really well. I also think it does a really good job of not portraying its main character, even though it's first person perspective. I think it really shows her flaws very well, and she's consistently got other characters calling her out on her different flaws, and I do like that. My one kind of like gripe with this book, and this is partially just because I read the audiobook, and maybe that's on me, but it is set in Ireland. Um, it is, like it's got a like Irish, all of the characters are Irish, but the audiobook has an American narrator, and it is like very strangely like Americanized. They use like Fahrenheit temperatures. They talk about the prize money in both euros, but also refer to the prize money as dollars. Which I just like, it was something that like, and then I think there was like couple other instances of like things that they changed from like, Irish um, terminology for them to like use American terminology for them, and it just like totally brought me out of the book. I felt it was really disorienting. And it kind of annoyed me because I think that actually making it obvious that this is, like an Irish story. It's about living in Ireland. It's about being a person of color in Ireland. It's about being specifically South Asian in Ireland, which, if you don't know me that well, you may not know that I'm actually Irish. My grandparents still live in Ireland. I'm an Irish citizen. I, like go there all the time. And so for me, like, I was really excited to see depictions of like people of color, like the stories of people of color in Ireland, because I think that a lot of people don't necessarily have this understanding of Ireland being more than just like, like white people, like really light skinned white people with like red hair. And like I think Ireland is way more diverse than that, and they actually do kind of make a note of this in the book. But you know the now they only recently changed it, but the previous Taoiseach, which is like the Prime Minister of Ireland, was South Asian. So I think that there's like the necessarily like people who don't know a lot about Ireland have a very they have this like very monolithic view of the country that I don't necessarily think the country reflects. So um, like that's why I was part of the reason I was so excited to read this story, because I think it's really important to have these like voices and have these stories about like being a person of color, and being a person of color like in the West, or like in a white majority nation, um, that isn't just like about like the UK or America, because I find that generally these kinds of, at least like the most hyped up sort of own voices stories that I tend to see about being in the UK or America. So I thought it was just like nice to see something, a little bit different for a change. I just wish they had a like different approach to the audiobook, because that kind of ruined the book for me a little bit, and it brought it down to like, I think I rated it like 3.5 stars, and it like the audiobook like ruined my experience that much. I think I would have enjoyed it a lot more if I'd had like an Irish narrator, or if the Americanization of the book hadn't been so like badly done. um, oh well. So the next book I want to talk about is another YA contemporary, which is On the Come Up by Angie Thomas. And where the Hana Wars failed with its narrator, I think the On the Come Up picked like the perfect narrator. I thought she was really, really good. On the Come Up, if you don't know it, is about a girl. It's sort of set in the same universe, the same kind of like a fictional city. I think it's like a fictional city, but it's like set in this like the same universe as Angie Thomas's first book, which is The Hate You Give. So it's like, and it's set after the events of The Hate You Give. So it does kind of like deal with these same kinds of discussions of like police brutality and stuff like that, but it's not as big of a focus of the narrative as the Hagen give. So it's about a girl who is her father was a famous underground rapper, and he died before he was sort of able to make it into the mainstream. And she wants to sort of become a rapper as well, you know, like not necessarily like because of her father, but she is inspired by him, and she wants to. She raps partially to feel this connection with him, but also because she's very talented at it, and it is really good because there are sort of like sections in verse and rap, um, and I think the narrator handles those really well. Like I think she can actually rap relatively well. So I really enjoyed that. I thought that she was a great pick as a narrator. I also think I really enjoyed this book. I think I gave it 5 stars because I just found it was like so enjoyable. It was like really, it was a fun read. It was like really emotional in a good way. I don't know what it is. I always like get so choked up with like any mother daughter relationship stories, and that is like a huge part of this book. I also think like this book deals a lot with you know like being a woman and like you know like being a woman of color, you know like being a black woman, and specifically the the main character's experience with you know like being feeling like isolated or feeling unheard because of her you know because of the fact that she's a black woman, and her experiences um, in that way, and like you know like she's trying so hard to be seen as like you know an intelligent and a you know like well thought out and you know like a sort of like a well-rounded and like diverse like a person who's like diverse in thought. Like she wants to be able to have other people see her as like this well-rounded person, and she experiences people only really seeing her as like a caricature of like this ghetto black woman, and she's trying really hard to like break out of that narrative and break out of that perception that people have of her. And I think that on the come up deals with that really well. I also really liked on the come up has like two side characters who are gay, and it deals really well with like their experiences. You know, I think it like it manages to talk about them being gay without having their story be entirely about like them being gay, but still like you know like it's not their story is not about them being gay, and their like relationship to the main character is not just like oh like I'm the gay best friend. Like they have like so much depth to them, where like you know they're like being gay is something that's like really important and it's like relevant in lots of parts of the story, but it's not the only thing that defines them. And I really enjoy that. I thought it was like just like such well written gay side characters, which I think you don't normally find in like especially in YA, but just like generally in fiction. You know, like the you don't normally have like this level of like complexity in like the gay best friend character. So I think it was actually done really well in On the Come Up. So I really enjoyed that. And so the final two books I want to talk about together are The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang and the Crazy Rich Asian series, specifically Rich People Problems by Kevin Kwan. So I listened to these audiobooks both earlier this year. The Poppy Wars I know is really it's quite popular on BookTube, and rightly so. If you don't know, if you somehow are on BookTube and haven't heard what it is an adult fantasy book about a girl who is you know she's a war orphan, and so she's about to be married off to this like really old rich guy, and she definitely doesn't want to, so she becomes a military officer um, for sort of like the royal army, and she is a so it's inspired by the Song dynasty. It's inspired by the Song dynasty era, but also by the um, World War II and by the Japanese occupation. So it's kind of a melding of like these two different aspects or like eras of Chinese history. And it's got like a really engaging fantasy aspect with it as well that revolves around the consumption of opium and the ways in which sort of that was dealt with within China. So I think that this book is a really, for me, I really loved it as a book about China. I really connected to Renin and her experiences, especially of being like, darker in China, like being and, like Chongzhen being spear, being, like these like dark islanders coming into China and then like that alienation for me, like my experiences of like being Malaysian, growing up in Hong Kong, I really connected to that feeling of like being so much darker than everyone else, being so different and feeling physically alienated from other people. So I really enjoyed that aspect of the book. I also really liked how it has all of these little aspects of it that like the cultural evidence of it being so deeply rooted in being Chinese and in Chinese culture that I think that it wouldn't necessarily be noticed by other people or by people who like aren't Chinese or don't know much about China, but for people who do, it like just really jumps out and is so interesting. Like to have these things being noticed. So like the one detail that I really loved was the discussion of her accent and the accent of the like capital city. So which was noted to like have like a distinct kind of like slurring and R sound in its vowels and in its words. And this is also something that is that exists within the Beijing accent. Lots of so like my experience, I actually have quite a Beijing accent when I speak Chinese, just because I had like Beijingers as some of my Chinese teachers, and like textbooks sometimes will like have like Beijing Chinese written in them, and so but all of my friends who like spoke Chinese, more like Hong Kongers, even though Putonghua was like, more like Hong Kong Guangdong inspired or like influenced, would make fun of me for like my quite strong Beijing accent. So it was that like even that aspect of it just jumped out at me as like something you don't normally see or being written about when you like read about China. And so like that's why I think it's a really powerful own voices story. And I also think obviously you can't read this book without talking about the Japanese occupation. I think it's a really good book because it is unflinchingly sort of like discusses the atrocities that occurred during the occupation, which I don't think you really see. Like I've never seen it in this book, and I also think it's good that like such a kind of popular book has this kind of like discussion of this history, which so many people, especially like Westerners, um, don't really have like much knowledge about, and like don't some people don't even know about the Asian front, about what happened in Asia during World War II, about these kinds of like war crimes and atrocities that happened within Asia, within China, but also in Malaysia, in Hong Kong, all of these different places. And so I think that the fact that it is willing to talk about these things, and it's willing to talk about them so unflinchingly, truthfully, saying like exactly like look at like these atrocities that happened, but also I hope like people who don't necessarily know a lot about the Japanese occupation use like their experiences with like reading this book to like learn more, to also realize that the time frame, like the time scale in the book is like relatively narrow between like initial occupation and kind of end of occupation, whereas like the actual occupation took like years, rather than I think the months that happen in the book. So it's like, so I think even then, even though the things that happen in the book are like so horrible, I think it's really important to realize that also it was even worse in reality. And I think that's like something that's so difficult to even think about. It's like the scale of the atrocities that happen is like unfathomable to me. So while reading this book, I definitely had to like switch off a couple times, and you like just take a break and be like, oh my god, because I like I felt it so severely. I was like thinking about my childhood and my relationship with my grandparents, and stuff like that. So that's also kind of why I wanted to recommend another Own Voices contemporary that also talks about the Japanese occupation, which is Crazy Rich Asians. So this may surprise some of you that haven't read the series or have only seen the movie. But the third book of the Crazy Rich Asians series, Rich People Problems, really like veers very severely into like becoming much more serious than the first two books. I think it's still like it has like the fun elements, like the satirical elements. It's still like such a great and fun book. I really enjoy the first two books as well. But the third book also spends a lot of time talking about the experiences of people under occupation, being in Malaysia, Singapore, um, and then also the generational trauma that comes from also that experience. So it has this relationship between one of the main characters and their grandmother, and just like how they feel, how they connect, or like this disconnect with their grandmother, with the like this history that they really can't fathom, they can't really understand. Um, or like, it's difficult because their grandmother doesn't talk about it that much. But it like affected her so deeply, and she's transmitting the same trauma down to them, even though they don't necessarily understand it. And so I think it deals with that experience really well. I also think that it has such a fantastic narrator. I really love the narrator of the Crazy Rich Asians sequels, because she does like all of the different accents, and she gets the nuances between the different accents like really accurately, in my opinion. Um, I think that she like creates, like she really makes you feel like you're in Southeast Asia, like you were traveling along like beside her. I think it's, especially if you don't know a lot about Southeast Asia, I think it's like such a great series to read and listen to, because it references a lot of like like these big cultural tropes, kinds of explains them, but also like in a fun way. So like it will explain like food and like different kind of like areas, or like habits of things. I also think that it's really important to realize that the Crazy Rich Asian series is not meant to be representative of all Asians, not even representative of all Asians in like Southeast Asia and China. It is very specifically about these like very wealthy upper class of Asians, and I think it represents those people very accurately. But I also like, for me, like this is a huge criticism that I saw was leveled against the movie that I don't necessarily feel is especially fair. But the book the book itself is like really good. I would highly recommend. I think it's such a great Own Voices story. So this is kind of my list of some different Own Voices titles I've been reading this year that I have I've really enjoyed, that have affected me in some kind of way, that have really made me think. So I would highly recommend you read any and all of these books. I will think that they have their own merits, and they, like talk about things that we see very rarely represented in modern fiction. I also think it's like fun to read, you know, like to see that Own Voices books don't necessarily just exist as like contemporary fiction or just as you know, like romance or just as YA. Like there is a huge diversity within different kinds of Own Voices stories, and I think these are all really important to look at and like to understand the diversity behind Own Voices stories. So if you have read any of these, please let me know your thoughts. Like, do you agree with me? Do you disagree with me? If you haven't read any of these, let me know if like you're going to pick any of these up, or if you have any Own Voices recommendations for me that you think I would enjoy. I would love to hear those. So please let me know if you enjoyed this video. I hope you enjoyed watching. Follow me on all of my socials. Yes, I did get a Goodreads. I will have them all linked down below. I hope you enjoyed I, um, I will have all of my socials linked down below. Yes, I did get a Goodreads. I will post also all of my reviews of these different books on my Goodreads and on my The Story Graph. So if you want to read sort of a more detailed review of these books, I will also leave them there. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you are having a great day, and bye.